Arabian executive buried his fiancée in the living room after falling for his 18-year-old lover. The mansion was a masterpiece of wealth and power, marble floors, golden chandeliers, and walls that had witnessed only luxury. But beneath its polished perfection lay a dark secret, hidden beneath the very floorboards of the living room. Karim Al-Fayed, a powerful Arabian executive, had always been a man of control. His empire stretched across nations, his wealth untouchable. His life was built on precision, every move calculated. But love was never part of the equation, until it shattered everything. He had been engaged to the perfect woman, chosen to secure his legacy. But then came Layla, barely 18, a temptation he could not resist, a passion too reckless, a love too dangerous. And one night, in the heat of desire, betrayal, and irreversible decisions, his fiancée vanished forever. But what happened next, no one could have foreseen. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This story will leave you speechless. The grand chandelier above the ballroom cast golden light over the sea of elegant guests. The scent of imported roses filled the air as waiters glided between conversations, offering champagne in crystal glasses. It was a night of celebration, a night of power, the night Karim Al-Fayed was to announce his engagement. Karim stood near the center of the room, dressed in an impeccable black suit, the weight of $1 million watch on his wrist. He was admired, respected, feared. The youngest billionaire in his industry, he commanded not just wealth, but absolute authority. Beside him, Nadia stood poised, her long raven-black hair cascading down the back of her emerald-green dress. She was the embodiment of class and perfection, his fiancée, chosen by their families to solidify their powerful union, a woman who belonged in his world. She smiled at the guests, playing her role to perfection. And yet, Karim felt nothing, no excitement, no anticipation, just a suffocating sense of finality. His dark eyes swept across the ballroom, his grip on his champagne flute tightening. Was this it? Was this how his life would be sealed? Then it happened. His gaze caught her, a figure at the far end of the room, Layla. She was nothing like the women in this world of wealth and power. Barely 18, fresh-faced, her beauty untouched by the weight of expectations. She wore a simple white dress, her golden skin illuminated under the soft glow of the chandeliers. She wasn't meant to be there, and yet she was. Karim's breath slowed. A rush of something unfamiliar, something dangerous, curled inside his chest. She wasn't for him. She was his fiancée's cousin, a girl who should have been invisible in a room like this. But to him, she was everything. Their eyes met, a silent recognition, a pull neither of them could explain. Layla's lips parted slightly, a flicker of something in her expression. Curiosity, caution, temptation. Then, Nadia touched his arm, breaking the moment. "Kareem," she said smoothly, her voice measured. "It's time." The microphone was waiting. The crowd was waiting. And suddenly, Kareem wanted nothing more than to run. But he didn't, because he was Kareem Al-Fayed. And men like him didn't run. They conquered. He stepped forward, taking the microphone, his voice steady as he made the announcement that would cement his fate. "This engagement marks the beginning of something powerful," he declared. "A future built on strength, unity, and tradition." Applause, cheers, but all he could feel was the weight of Layla's gaze on him. And in that moment, Kareem knew. This was the beginning of something he could never undo. The engagement party ended, but the weight of that night lingered like an untamed storm in Kareem's mind. He sat in the back of his sleek black Rolls-Royce as it glided through the city, the hum of the engine blending with his thoughts. He was supposed to feel victorious. Securing his engagement to Nadia meant fortifying his legacy, ensuring his name would remain untouchable. And yet, all he could think about was her. Layla. The way her eyes had lingered on him. The way her breath had hitched when their gazes locked. The way his body had reacted. An unfamiliar heat. A craving he had no right to feel. A girl like her wasn't meant for a man like him. Innocent. Untouched. And yet, she had looked at him as if she had sensed something dark and dangerous inside him. Something she wanted. His phone buzzed. Nadia. He let it ring. Instead, his fingers gripped the armrest, his jaw tightening. He had always been in control. Always. But for the first time, he felt the stirrings of something reckless inside him. The car pulled into the grand driveway of his estate, the towering gates closing behind them. The mansion, with its sweeping glass windows and modern perfection, felt too silent tonight. As Kareem stepped out, Malik, his most trusted bodyguard, greeted him at the entrance. "Everything secure?" Kareem asked, his voice sharp, trying to ground himself in routine. "Yes, sir," Malik confirmed, his sharp eyes scanning for threats. Kareem nodded and strode inside, his polished shoes echoing against the marble floor. But even as he entered the grand foyer, he felt it again. That ache, that pull. His body knew what his mind refused to admit. He needed to see her. Midnight. The world was asleep, but Kareem was wide awake. The city lights stretched beyond his floor-to-ceiling windows, but his focus was elsewhere. On her. He stood in his private study, fingers grazing the edge of his whiskey glass, watching her. Layla was in the guest wing of his estate. She had no idea he was standing there, looking down from the terrace above, hidden in the shadows. She was sitting on the balcony outside her suite, her long hair cascading down her back. She had changed into a delicate silk nightgown, nothing revealing, and yet it drove him mad. She looked untouched by the chaos of this world, unaware of the storm she was stirring inside him. A cigarette burned between Kareem's fingers, the embers flickering against the night. He had never been the kind of man to stalk, to fixate. Women were meant to be conquered, not obsessed over. And yet, here he was. His pulse thrummed as Layla leaned back, stretching, the moonlight casting a silver glow on her golden skin. He clenched his jaw. He shouldn't be here. He shouldn't be watching. But as if sensing his presence, she suddenly looked up. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Kareem could see it in her expression, the hesitation, the curiosity, the quiet hunger. And then, to his utter destruction, she smiled. Not a shy smile, not an innocent one, a knowing one, a deliberate one. Kareem exhaled sharply, stepping back into the shadows. This girl was going to ruin him, and he was going to let her. Kareem didn't sleep that night. He tried. He poured himself a drink, loosened the collar of his shirt, and sat in the dim glow of his study, but his mind refused to quiet. The taste of whiskey did nothing to drown out the fire Layla had ignited inside him. That smile, that knowing, wicked smile. She was playing with fire, and she knew it. By morning, the illusion of control he had fought to maintain was already slipping. His engagement to Nadia felt like a chokehold, tightening around his throat with every second that passed. And then, as if fate itself was testing his resolve, Layla walked into the dining hall. She had changed from the delicate silk nightgown into something just as dangerous. A summer dress, soft, flowing, innocent on the surface, yet clinging to her in all the wrong places. His fingers curled into a fist beneath the table. He had invited her here, hadn't he? It was his own fault. She was Nadia's cousin, a guest in his home, part of the perfect facade of a family celebration before the wedding. Yet, as she entered, it felt like she owned the room. Nadia greeted her warmly, oblivious. "Layla, did you sleep well?" Layla's gaze flicked briefly to Kareem before she smiled. "Very well." Kareem felt the weight of those words like a blade against his skin. He should have been indifferent. He should have looked away. Instead, he found himself watching her every move, the way her fingers brushed against the fabric of her dress, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. And she knew it. When she finally met his eyes across the table, she held his gaze, her lips curving slightly, teasingly. Kareem exhaled through his nose. This was madness. Yet as the morning carried on, as conversations swirled around him, he barely heard a word, because the only thing he could focus on was her. That afternoon, the dam finally broke. Kareem had left the estate, using business as an excuse to escape the storm inside him. He had buried himself in meetings, drowning in deals, trying to forget her. But it was useless. By the time he returned, the sun was setting, casting long golden streaks across the estate. The air was heavy with heat, and then she was there. Standing alone by the infinity pool, the water reflecting her silhouette. Kareem should have walked away. Instead, he walked toward her. Layla didn't turn, but he knew she sensed him. The air between them was thick, electric, toxic. "I didn't think you'd come back so soon," she murmured, still gazing at the water. Kareem didn't respond immediately. He stopped just behind her, too close, the scent of her skin weaving into his breath. "I shouldn't be here," he said quietly. She finally turned, tilting her head slightly, her dark eyes full of something dangerous. "Then why are you?" Kareem clenched his jaw. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't nervous. She was testing him, and he was losing. "I should be asking you the same thing," he said, his voice low. "Why did you smile at me last night?" Layla's lips parted, but she didn't answer immediately. Then, a small, wicked smirk. "Because you were watching me." Kareem exhaled harshly, running a hand through his hair. She was too young for this, too untouched. But she wasn't naive. She knew. "This is a dangerous game, Layla," he warned. She stepped closer. "I know." A long, unforgivable silence stretched between them, and then, before he could stop himself, Kareem did the one thing he had sworn he wouldn't do. He touched her. His fingers found her wrist, the pulse beneath her skin pounding just as violently as his own. Layla sucked in a breath, and in that moment, Kareem knew there was no turning back. Kareem should have pulled away, but he didn't. His fingers remained wrapped around Layla's wrist, his grip firm but not forceful. He could feel the rapid pulse beneath her skin, mirroring his own heartbeat. Fast, reckless, out of control. Layla didn't move. She didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with something that shouldn't be there. Invitation. "This is a mistake," Kareem murmured, his voice low and tight. Layla tilted her head slightly, her lips parting. "Then why aren't you letting go?" The words sliced through his restraint like a blade. Because he couldn't. Because he didn't want to. Kareem exhaled harshly and finally released her wrist, stepping back as if breaking free from a spell. He turned away, pressing his fingers to his temple, trying to ground himself. "Go inside," he ordered, his voice rough. Layla hesitated for only a second before obeying, her bare feet barely making a sound against the marble floors as she disappeared into the estate. Kareem stayed behind, gripping the edge of the stone railing, his knuckles white. This was insanity. Absolute insanity. She was forbidden. She was off limits. And yet, he had touched her. And worse, she had let him. That night, Kareem barely spoke at dinner. He sat at the head of the long dining table, his body tense, his mind fractured. Every time he lifted his gaze, Layla was there. Seated between her relatives, laughing softly at something Nadia said, as if she wasn't tearing him apart. Nadia, his fiancée, sat beside him, elegant as ever. She reached for his hand, a casual, expected gesture, but when her fingers touched his skin, Karim flinched. She frowned slightly. "Is everything all right?" He forced a smile, withdrawing his hand under the table. "Just tired." But as the dinner continued, as the glasses of wine emptied and conversations faded into the background, he felt Layla's gaze on him. When he finally met her eyes, she didn't look away. A silent challenge. Karim swallowed hard. This had to end. After dinner, he made his way to his office, needing space, needing distance. But fate wasn't merciful, because just as he closed the door behind him, Layla was already inside, waiting. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick, suffocating. Karim's pulse hammered against his ribs. "What are you doing here?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. Layla was standing near the bookshelf, her fingers grazing the edge of a leather-bound novel. "I couldn't sleep." Karim let out a humorless chuckle. "And you think coming here was the solution?" She took a slow step forward, her dress brushing against her legs. "I think we both know why I'm here." His entire body tensed. "This is dangerous," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Layla smiled softly. "Then tell me to leave." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He should, but he didn't, because he wanted her to stay. The moment stretched between them, unbearable, intoxicating. And then she moved. Soft, deliberate steps, until she was standing directly in front of him, so close he could feel the warmth of her skin. Karim clenched his jaw, his entire body wound tight like a bowstring. "Layla." She reached up, her fingers barely grazing his collar. A whisper of a touch, a test, a provocation, a choice, and Karim, a man who had spent his life in control, who had built an empire on discipline, lost. With a sharp breath, he grabbed her wrist, just as he had by the pool. But this time, he didn't let go. This time, he pulled her closer. Her breath hitched, her lashes fluttering. And then, the inevitable. Their lips met. A slow, agonizing collision. A war between hesitation and inevitability. The moment Karim Al-Fayed crossed the line, he could never erase. Should the next chapter show the aftermath of their first kiss? Or should Nadia begin sensing something is wrong? Let me know how deep you want this betrayal to unfold. Karim never believed in fate. His entire life had been built on control, on making things happen, never waiting for destiny to intervene. But in that moment, with Layla's lips pressed against his, her body warm against his own, he knew he had just stepped into something irreversible. A mistake. A sin. A pleasure he didn't have the strength to resist. Her fingers clutched the fabric of his shirt, hesitant but needy. Kareem's grip on her waist was tight, firm, as if his body was trying to claim what his mind knew he could never have. His heart slammed against his ribs. He could feel hers doing the same. Then, a sound. A faint shuffle outside the door. Reality crashed back like ice water. Kareem pulled away abruptly, his breath ragged. Layla's eyes flickered with shock, her lips slightly swollen, her chest rising and falling too fast. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Layla took a shaky step back, touching her lips, realization dawning on her face. She had just kissed her cousin's fiancé. They had both just destroyed something that could never be undone. Kareem's jaw tightened. "You need to go." Her breath hitched, but she nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. Without another word, she slipped through the door and disappeared down the hallway. Kareem stayed behind, his hands braced against the desk, his entire body burning with what he had just done. He had just tasted his own downfall. The next morning, Kareem forced himself to act as if nothing had happened. He sat at the long dining table, sipping black coffee as if his entire world hadn't just cracked open the night before. Layla arrived late, slipping into her seat across from him. She didn't look at him. Good. She shouldn't. Because if she did, if she met his gaze, he didn't know if he would be strong enough to act like nothing had changed. Nadia, oblivious, reached for Kareem's hand. "You've been distant," she murmured. "Is something wrong?" Kareem barely kept his face neutral. Everything was wrong. But he forced a small smile. "Just work." Nadia nodded, satisfied. But as he let go of her hand, his eyes betrayed him, slipping toward Layla, unable to stop himself. And that's when it happened. Layla glanced up, just for a second. A flicker of last night passed between them, a memory of heat, of crossed lines and stolen breaths, a silent secret. And Kareem knew then, this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. Later that day, Kareem stood in his office, staring at his reflection in the glass windows. His mind was at war. He needed to end this, whatever this was, before it destroyed him. A soft knock. His stomach tightened. He already knew who it was before he turned around. Layla. She hesitated in the doorway, her hands gripping the sides of her dress. She looked uncertain, but not regretful. That should have been his first warning. "I need to leave," she whispered. Kareem's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "You should," he said, his voice low, controlled. Lying. She took a step forward. Kareem clenched his jaw. "Layla," she swallowed. "I thought about last night." He exhaled sharply, turning away. "Then forget it." "I can't," she whispered. His pulse pounded. Layla's voice wavered. "Can you?" Silence. She already knew the answer, because if he could forget, he wouldn't be clenching his hands to keep from reaching for her again. Karim turned to face her, his dark eyes burning. "This is dangerous." Layla took another step. "Then stop me." Another beat of silence. Another moment too long. Then he didn't. And that was the moment Karim Al-Fayed sealed his fate. The air between them was thick, unforgiving, a force neither of them could control. Layla stood just a few feet away, her eyes locked onto his, waiting for him to tell her to leave. But Karim didn't, because he couldn't. He had built his entire life on control, on power, on never making mistakes. But standing here with her, none of it mattered. She was the one thing he was never meant to have, and yet she was standing in his office, waiting for him to do what they both knew was inevitable. His voice was tight, almost desperate. "Layla, if you stay here any longer—" She stepped closer. The final warning he should have given her died on his lips. "I'm not afraid of you," she whispered. She should have been. He was a man with everything to lose, and she was about to make him lose it all. Karim snapped. One moment, they were standing apart. The next, his hands were on her waist, pulling her against him, his breath mixing with hers. Layla gasped softly, but she didn't resist, didn't pull away, because she wanted this too. The moment his lips met hers, he knew he was finished. It wasn't soft. It wasn't sweet. It was desperate, starved. The kind of kiss that felt like a war between right and wrong, between reason and recklessness. His fingers curled into her hair, pulling her closer. Layla's hands slid up his chest, hesitating for only a moment before gripping his shirt. A silent plea, a silent surrender. And Karim was done fighting. But then, a knock at the door. Reality crashed down like a blade. They tore apart, breathing heavily. Layla's eyes were wide, her lips swollen from his kiss. Karim forced himself to move, his heart hammering against his ribs. The door opened before he could fix himself, and standing there was Nadia. For a moment, no one moved. Nadia's eyes swept over the room, over Karim's disheveled shirt, over Layla's too flushed face, over the tension so thick it was suffocating. Karim forced himself to speak first. "Nadia." His voice was steady, controlled, a lie. She smiled softly, but it was the kind of smile that sent chills down his spine, the kind that meant she already knew. "I was looking for you," she said, stepping inside, her eyes flickering between them. "Both of you, actually." Layla tensed beside him. Karim clenched his jaw. "For what?" Nadia let out a quiet laugh. "For lunch." Her gaze finally settled on him, sharp, knowing. "But I see I interrupted something." Layla looked away. Karim held Nadia's gaze. "It's not what you think." Another lie. Nadia studied him. Then, slowly, she turned to Layla. Her voice was too soft, too dangerous. "Why do you look so nervous, cousin?" Layla's hands clenched into fists. I don't." Nadia smiled, a predator's smile. Then she turned back to Karim. "You've been different lately," she mused. "Distant." Karim's throat felt tight. "It's work." Nadia nodded, stepping closer. Too close. She reached up, her fingers brushing against his collar, the same way Layla had done just moments ago. Karim didn't move, because he knew if he did, she would see it. She would know. Nadia exhaled, dropping her hand. "You know," she murmured, "people always say, I'm the kind of woman who sees what others don't." She let the words linger. Then she smiled again. "I'll see you both at lunch." And just like that, she walked out. Karim let out a slow, sharp breath. Layla looked up at him, eyes wide with fear. She knows. Karim ran a hand over his face because she was right. Nadia knew, and that meant everything was about to fall apart. Nadia knew. Karim felt it in the way she looked at him, the way her smile was just a little too calm, a little too knowing. She wasn't a fool. At lunch, she acted as if nothing was wrong, laughing softly, engaging in polite conversation. But every so often, her eyes would flicker toward him, toward Layla, watching, calculating.